Imagine yourself in a clearing, your stomach empty and the sun falling low. You see a flock of quails just meters away. They seem slow, almost foolish. You attempt a quick rush, and in a flutter of wings, they vanish. Why is something so visible, so difficult to capture? The answer lies not in strength, but in observation. Seated at the edge of a stubble field, where tall grass meets forest, you begin to perceive that the movement of quails is not random. The quail passes through the same place for the third time. She follows a line almost identical to the two previous passages, slightly left of the large stone, skirting the low-branched shrub, disappearing where vegetation closes. The quail does not walk without pattern. She walks the same pattern repeated dozens of times daily, with a fidelity to trajectory that seems almost mechanical once you begin to recognize it. The problem is that recognizing this pattern requires a type of attention most people have never trained, the attention of one who waits without knowing what they expect to see. Someone arriving with real hunger, without rifle, without steel traps, someone in an open field with nothing but their own hands and what vegetation offers, will discover that the quail is simultaneously the most accessible target and the easiest to miss. Accessible because it exists in nearly every open field region, active during the day, visible in groups. Easy to miss because your first attempt to capture it will reveal an ignorance that the rush of survival normally prevents you from noticing in time. There is a signal that someone looking for the first time at quail movement does not see. It is on the ground, not on the bird itself. Where terrain has lower grass, where vegetation forms natural passages between bushes or tufts, the quail will choose the same path repeatedly. Not because she is stupid, because she is efficient. Each time she traveled that corridor without encountering danger, she recorded it as safe. The signal left in the soil is subtle, grass slightly compressed, a small flattening where feet have landed repeatedly, sometimes a thin line of straw displaced. It is almost nothing. It is enough. Ignoring this signal means setting your snare in the wrong place, and the wrong place means you will never capture the quail, even if the snare is technically perfect. Location precedes everything, and location only appears to those who can read what the ground is telling them. The North American quail is a small animal, compact body, short legs powerful for its proportion. It does not fly in sustained fashion. When frightened, it explodes in low-altitude flight for short distance and lands again, preferring to run rather than fly whenever possible. This preference for ground is what makes it vulnerable to snares positioned in passage corridors. They feed in groups, picking seeds, small insects, plant shoots. When the group feels threatened, the immediate tendency is to compress and run together, not scatter. Where passage narrows, passage concentrates. Quail feeding habits follow the light cycle with reasonable consistency. They emerge early, feed until midday, and move again in late afternoon. The trapper who understands this cycle knows that snares must be ready before movement, ready and without fresh human scent. The quail has functional sense of smell, but its primary sensory vulnerability lies in lateral vision. It perceives peripheral movement with surprising speed. Any snare that moves irregularly with wind will alert it before it arrives. The snare must be still. It must seem part of that corridor. The fundamental principle behind the quail snare is simple to state and difficult to execute without real understanding of the animal. You do not create a trap. You position a consequence where existing behavior will occur. Someone thinking of setting a snare thinks, "I will make the quail pass through the snare." Someone who masters the technique thinks, "I will identify where the quail already passes and position the snare at that point." The first reasoning leads to attempts to create artificial corridors, to force direction. The second leads to patient observation and discrete positioning. The results are radically different. The snare is not a machine, it is a weight positioned with precision. There was little light still when the field began to gain movement.
It was not visible movement immediately, it was the different quality of silence that someone who has been still long enough learns to distinguish from true silence. First, a rustling distant between tufts, then the dry sound of paws on compacted soil, multiple at once. The flock came by the same route as yesterday morning, skirted the large stone on the left, compressed between two bushes, spread again after passing the tall grass tuft. The compression point was the same, the height of the birds consistent, heads at approximately 8 to 10 centimeters from ground. This observation has no value unless transformed into precise technical decision: where exactly to position the snare, at what height, how to guarantee it will not move nor call attention. These questions only make sense after the movement pattern is real, not supposed.
The quail snare, in survival conditions, without elaborate materials, is constructed with what is available. The two most reliable options are brass wire and twisted horsehair. Brass wire maintains loop shape without tendency toward collapse or expansion. Horsehair, when braided in 3 or 4 strands, has surprising resistance and the advantage of being nearly invisible in natural environment. The loop must be between 4 and 5 centimeters in internal diameter, slightly larger than an adult quail's head. Not much larger, because too large a loop allows the bird to pass through without triggering. Not much smaller, because a small loop will contact the neck before the bird is sufficiently inside for tightening to be effective. Construction begins with a functional slip knot. The knot must slide with ease under tension. Any rigidity means the tightening will be slow, and the bird will free itself before the snare closes. The snare test is done with your own hand. Open the loop to correct diameter, hold one end, and pull the other with firm, quick movement. The knot must slide without any perceptible resistance. If it hesitates, redo it. The snare is suspended with thin branches driven vertically into soil on both sides of the corridor. Do not use fresh-cut green wood. The difference in color and smell are perceptible enough to alter the bird's behavior. Use dry branches, already present in the environment. Drive with sufficient firmness that the branch does not sway in light breeze. The height of loop suspension is the detail most frequently wrong for those learning by description without having observed the animal closely. The loop's lowest point should be approximately 3 centimeters from ground. The quail, walking with head slightly inclined downward while feeding, will insert her head into the loop before realizing it is there. If the loop is too high, 5 centimeters or more, most birds will pass underneath. If it sits flush against the ground, the bird will notice the obstacle and veer away. The free end of the snare must be tied to a firm stake, at least 15 centimeters from the loop. Too short allows the bird to pull the entire snare away before being immobilized. Too long makes it difficult to achieve the tension necessary for the slip knot to close with speed. In corridors of good width, position 2 or 3 snares in sequence, separated by about 20 centimeters. But each additional snare represents more installation time, more human contact, greater risk of introducing scent or visual alteration. The practical rule: in survival situation with limited time, 2 well-positioned snares surpass 4 snares with installation errors. After installing, do not return for at least 2 hours. The scent of human hands remains intense long enough to drive the birds from the corridor. The temptation to check quickly is the error most often made by those hungry and anxious. Sometimes the problem is the weight of knowledge itself. Someone who read about snares, memorized the correct suspension height, knows the slip knot must slide without resistance. That person arrives at the field with technical confidence that can be more harmful than complete ignorance, because technical confidence shortens observation. You believe you already know where to position the snare before you have watched the animal long enough. The field changes. Behavior changes with the field. A group of quails that used a certain corridor for weeks can change routes after rain,
after a predator crosses the area, after any disturbance that introduces uncertainty into the habitual path. Technical knowledge, correct applied in the wrong place, is still applied wrong. This is the rupture that excess theory produces, the belief that technique substitutes for observation, when in reality, technique only functions after observation.
The bait does not attract the bird into the snare directly. The quail following a habitual corridor is not being seduced by specific bait. She is following the pattern she already knows. The role of bait is to reinforce the use of that specific corridor, increasing passage density in a short period. Small grains, cracked corn, oats, millet, or wild seeds, distributed with moderation along the corridor, increase the probability the group will pass precisely there more than once. Excess grains creates collective alert behavior rather than calm passage in file. Too little creates no additional attraction. Distribution must follow the logic of the group's natural movement. Grains before the installation point, some within the snare area, few beyond. The goal is for the bird to advance naturally through the snare region while feeding, not to stop abruptly. Birds that stop before the snare, remain still, then back away, have perceived something wrong, probably human scent or visual irregularity. Scatter with short movements. Avoid stepping in the passage corridor directly. Cover footprints if soil is soft. Leave the corridor as close to how it was before human intervention as possible. The quail does not reject the corridor. She rejects anything that signals the corridor has changed. The snare was installed in the early morning hours. 2 snares, in sequence in the corridor between bushes, thin brass wire, loop of 4.5 centimeters, suspension at 3 centimeters from ground. Grains distributed with moderation before and after the point. No return for 2.5 hours. First check. The grains along the corridor were partially consumed. The snares intact, no capture. Grains immediately before the second snare, consumed. The snare itself, intact. The analysis was immediate. The birds had reached the corridor, consumed grains to the second snare, and stopped. Either the loop was too high for this specific group, or something about the loop had alerted them at the final approach. The check revealed the problem. The supporting branch of the second snare had sunk slightly under the weight of the wire and morning soil moisture, lowering the loop to nearly ground level. The bird would have touched the loop with the front of its body before inserting its head, sufficient signal for immediate retreat. The correction was simple. New supporting branch, thicker, driven with greater firmness, height recalibrated. Second test in the afternoon. Result, 1 quail captured in the first snare. What this error teaches is not that the technique is difficult. It is that the technique does not tolerate installation done once and abandoned without review. The soil, the weight of the wire, humidity, the angle of the branch, everything interacts after installation in ways theory does not fully anticipate. Review before the first animal activity cycle is part of the technique, not exception to it. The quail snare is technique of presence, not absence. You do not install and forget. You install, observe from distance, review before the animal's movement cycle, adjust according to what the field reveals. The trap does not substitute for attention. It demands continuous attention of different type, not pursuit, not physical effort, but constant reading of what the environment and the animal are communicating. Someone expecting the technique to do the work will find snares intact and grains consumed around them, repeatedly, without understanding why. Someone who understands that technique is extension of an observational posture will recognize the signal. The grains went this far, the loop was avoided, and will know exactly what to correct. The problem was never the snare. The problem was the reading. There is something that only appears when you have been still enough in a field where you know quails will pass. It is not urgency. It is a kind of attention that has no fixed object. You are not looking at a specific point waiting for the bird to appear there. You are present for the entire field, open to what moves, to what changes in tone, to the sound that appears where there was no sound. This quality of attention is not taught as technique. It appears when the body understands that active pursuit will not work. The quail snare only works completely when the person who installed it also learned to wait the right way. Not as exercise in patience, as recognition that the field functions according to a rhythm that will not adjust to human rhythm, and that finding capture requires entering the field's rhythm, not imposing rhythm on the field. The flock passed through the corridor near sunset, when the light had lowered enough to blur the definition of the field's edges. There was no way to see the snare from the observation position. There was only the sound of the flock advancing, those light paws on dry soil, that rustling of birds compressing in a narrow corridor. And then, different from everything that had sounded before, the sound of movement interrupted. Not flight, not alarm, the specific sound of a bird that encountered unexpected resistance. After that, the field became quiet. The captured bird had not triggered alarm in the flock. The field returned to its normal breathing as if nothing had changed. This is how it works when it works. Without drama, without visible struggle, the corridor remains corridor. The flock remains flock. Only one element does not remain, and that element is caught in the loop someone had patience to position in the exact place the field had indicated. The field does not warn when it will work. It warns where it will work if you know how to listen. The difference between these two types of warning is what separates those who install snares from those who capture quails.